humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piran Nair, fellow Nyanis. I want to first wish all of you all Happy New Year, and it's good to well, we had a satsang last week. We celebrated Christmas, and I spoke about the values of Christ and how it impacts us. And today, we're in 2025, and I'm going to continue our discussion. But more importantly, let's reflect back on what we have covered so far. So far, I've covered that there is a whole science behind meditation. And we see that, when we practice meditation, there is a structural change that happens in our brain. And I spoke about the 11 parts of our brain that undergoes transformation. And this is essentially, as I said in my previous satsangs, that when I was practicing meditation more than 40 over years, in the early phases, meditation was very difficult. Concentration was very difficult, right? And over time, there was micro level changes, and I didn't understand the changes. And as those changes started to take place more profoundly, I realized that there was something happening within me. And that is the time I was reading Mahan's I Got book, many great saints and sages, and they were documenting the changes that they were going through or they have undergone through. And I had similar experiences. And at that time, I was, studying in university. I was doing science and, in various laboratories. And then I said to myself, something is happening and I need to really understand what this is. And oftentimes when people meditate, okay, the feeling is very nice, great, it is good. So I felt good by practicing meditation. I felt more energetic. I felt, a little bit more happier. But somehow there was a question in me that asked me that is this practice, leading to what we call placebo effect. Placebo effect is just a psychological effect that may not be real. It is somewhat like a doctor is administering a medicine. He wants to see whether the medicine is effective. So you have two groups of patients. One, he gives the medicine. The second one, he gives what they sometimes call the, something which does not have the compound in there. Sometimes, sugar, water, whatever, right? But there's no active compound of the medicine. And occasionally, the people that don't get the medicine show a high level of recovery or high level. So the active compound is there and suddenly they feel better. And scientists call this as placebo effect. That means the effect is because of psychological, state where we think we are getting the medicine, and that by thinking that we are getting the medicine, psychologically we become more, the changes happen. So it may not be real. So I was just thinking to myself, am I experiencing the placebo effect, or is there something real that is happening? And I started exploring this, and I realized that Mahans and other great saints also had the similar question. What is real? So, but I knew as a scientist that there was structural, I can feel that experience, but I couldn't express it, I couldn't explain it. So I was reading about great people like Carl Jung and all the great Western and Eastern scholars. They all talk about this kind of, something that is unexplainable that we have with us, that it is not matter or energy. It is something much more far transcendental to matter and energy. Of course, in our scriptures, we saw that Atma, we saw the soul, all those things. And Mahan never used that language. Mahan used the language called small I and big I. And I started looking at his work a little bit more carefully, and he always used this term called Unarvu. Unarvu is life force. Kundalini Unarvu. And they all were very separate concepts, but it didn't all come together. But I know that they were all explaining and trying to express this formless, dimensionless force that is within us, that is separate from the formed force of our body. And they were all describing this. But Mahan's teachings was, so most of the scriptures, most of the teachings were very abstract, but Mahan's teachings spoke about how to experience this. And I asked this question, am I experiencing this thing called soul or life force or Atma? But why is it that I was feeling great? What is it that in me that is making me feel more peaceful, more calmer, more cooler? And then when I started referring to Mahan's Non-Kadol book, I Got book, page 225, the new 6th edition, he speaks about that structural changes that will happen in the brain, the 6 parts. If you get a chance, take a look at it. So I started looking at it a little bit more carefully, and then I said there must be some changes that are happening in us when we practice this meditation, this mindfulness. And that journey took me to exploring what happens when we meditate, what happens when we do yoga, what happens when we walk, we do exercise, when we eat food, the changes that happens to the brain. And over the last few satsangs, I spoke about how meditation makes major micro level transformation. Over a short period of time, you don't feel it, but over a long period of time, there are major structural changes, transformation that happens to our brain. And I covered, there are 11 parts I covered, from the prefrontal cortex right up to the last one, which I spoke about, the stem, brain stem. Today, I want to conclude this with the final part of this meditational practice on how the brain and other parts of the body is connected. And I'm going to touch on a very important part of our meditational practice that has an impact on our body called the spinal cord. And this has various physiological, psychological, mental, and also spiritual experiences that one can get. So I want to spend some time today just to I covered the first 11 parts of the structural changes that happens in our brain that helps us to be more calmer, more cooler, more focused, a whole host of things that you can refer to in the last 10 parts. I want to today cover this thing called the spinal cord, and it is very important in the context of Mahan's I Got philosophy, Mahan's meditation. So what is this spinal cord? And you'll see this chart here. The spinal cord goes from the base right up to, our neck. And then there's a connection, which is the stem connection to the whole brain, which I covered in part 10. So this spinal cord is the 12th part of the structure of our body that connects our brain and all the other organs that we have. So let's go through, and then I'll talk about how meditation impacts this. So this spinal cord is actually a very thin bundle of nervous tissue that support cells. There are a lot of support cells in that small, the thin layer that is running the spinal cord there. And the important part of this is actually, it is, as I said, our whole brain has electrical and, neurochemical impact. And this spinal cord is very important for receiving electrical signals from the body to the brain and vice versa, from the brain to the body. So that interconnection is very important. And interestingly, the spinal cord is protected by vertebra or kind of like bones, different sizes, and it has got spinal fluid that protects the nervous tissue. So it's somewhat like an electrical cable. You have the copper wires, and then there's a coating around it that prevents the wires from, sometimes multiple wires from touching each other and short circuiting. So somewhat like our circuit system in our body, right? Now we see that, whenever this spinal cord is like the wiring of our body. And we see that that bundle of tissues or bundle of wiring is very important for us to experience, all the signals from the body, from our lungs, our heart, everything goes to the brains and vice versa, and through various hormones, they are regulated. Now, this is very important that when we are practicing meditation, something very interesting happens. Remember the parts of the brains that are really firing away, it is receiving signals from all our organs, and, it's saying, okay, there is this, hunger. So the brain then processes, it releases hormones, and then, a whole host of things happen. The same thing with breathing, the heart movement, the heart pumping, all those things. There's a feedback between the organs and the brain, and they are regulated through those processes, including our breathing and everything else. But something very interesting happens is that the spinal cord is sometimes called the highway to infinity, and I'll explain why that is the case in the meditational practice, right? If you read Yogananda's book, he covers that in his version of the Bhagavad Gita, right? Mahan speaks also about that spinal cord. Something very interesting happens that in the early phase, when the child is born, it's already wired, but the connection may not be as evolved. And this is part of nature's way of building the interconnectivity between the brain that helps us, make sense of the world, and that spinal cord that brings all the information from the various organs and the flow of information back for these organs to function optimally. Something very interesting happens, as our body matures, this part of the body, the spinal cord, also develops, and until the age of maturity. And then after that, you see that, depending on the biology of the body, how much you look after your body, and so on, the aging comes. As we age, the brain, and the spinal cord starts losing its nerve cells, and we see that, something called atrophy takes place. Okay? And sometimes the information flow slows down. And when that happens, you see this flow of information takes place. We see that sometimes when it's not flowing properly, you have a lot of unwanted chemicals that gets deposited, in parts of your brain and so on. We see that we get tired, we get exhausted. After a while, fatigue sets in. We also see that the discs that the wiring is there. Also, sometimes over aging, it kind of dries out, and the cushion is no more there, and you see that you get backaches and all. So we call it this degeneration. So this is why you see that yoga practices, asanas, are all very important, and we see that meditation actually, when we practice our meditation, the meditation actually enables the flow of that neural activity more efficiently, right? And that flow of that information, the electrical pulse, helps to make that spinal cord more, you know, efficient and more stronger. And if you practice that with a little bit of yoga asanas, exercise, stretching, all those things helps stretch that nerves. And this improves the health of our brain and our body, because that flow, that highway is really important for that electrical pulse to move forward. Somewhat like our highways, right? If our highways are clogged, you can't move, right? In that same way, if that highway is, the cells are degenerating and so on, you see that the flow is not so great. Parts of our brain start shutting down, parts of our organs start shutting down, and you see that over time, this has an impact, on the brain. Now, that is why you see that meditation is so important, that when we practice meditation, we see that that flow of that electrical pulse from that base right up to the brain continuously takes place. That pathway becomes very smooth. And actually, when I cover Mahan's meditation method, you can actually feel that flow. Sometimes you see in many uh, books, it's written that flow. You feel that as though the snake is rising up, the serpent is rising up. What it is actually the neuro chemical reaction that is causing that electromagnetic fields to pass through this spinal cord, the highway, that you can actually feel that flow. That flow is very important because the spinal cord leads to various nerves that connects to various organs, and you can actually feel that vibration, the pulse in many parts of your body if your mind is quiet, right? So this is the first part that we see, that connection between the brain and the spinal cord is so important for the health of the overall body. Of course, the health of the brain is very important, right? And meditation helps us, but also the health of the brain is interconnected with the health of the spinal cord and every part of our body. Now, I want to come back to why we sit in that lotus position. Right? Many people, sit down in many different ways of meditation. But if you see Swamiji's picture there, he's sitting in a lotus position. And I always encourage those who are learning to practice meditation, try to sit in that lotus position. And if you cannot, try to do some stretching exercises, because there is tremendous benefit from sitting in this lotus position, because it helps the health of the spinal cord. The health of the spinal cord has an impact on the health of the brain. The health of the brain has an impact on the health of the mind and the intellect and our own life experience. Why the lotus position, the Padmasana pose? Actually, if you see very carefully, when you sit in that position, it actually enables hip opening, right? Oftentimes we sit or stand, the hip is not opened. And when we regularly sit in this position, it opens our hip. And actually what we do is we exercise our hip. That muscle coordination, muscle movement, opening and closing, strengthens the joints in our hips, strengthens the muscles in our hips. And more importantly, you see that those days people used to sit on the floor and eat. They used to sit on the floor and study. But today we have the comforts of the chair. Our sitting posture is not the best posture, right? So enabling the hip opening has so much benefits for males and for females, particularly for women who have very small hip. This opening up the hip is very important for the exercise, particularly when they are expecting or about to deliver a baby. And if you see that when they have this mothers who are expecting, they go for these exercises, and one of the exercises actually sitting in this position and stretching. It helps them in the childbirth. But for meditators, when you sit down in this position and you stretch, something very interesting happens. That when we sit in this lotus position, when that hip opening takes place, it stretches the nerves on your thigh right up to the spinal cord. So when that stretching takes place, the nerves are more tighter and more straight. I wouldn't say straight, they're more kind of, elastic, that the flow of the energy is much more intensive. So those who are sitting in that position will feel that Muladhara, the base, energy feel much more stronger. So that sitting in that position, opening the hip, activates many muscles that stimulates various, uh, key transmitters, neurotransmitters, and in that part of the body, particularly in the base. It also gives you that flexibility. The flexibility comes the nerves become more, elastic, and the flow of that energy becomes much more better. It also helps us with the posture. Our spine become more straighter. When you sit on the chair, our spine don't have that posture. And normally when we sit, we don't sit with any kind of, padding in the back. We sit straight. So the spine is straight. And the spine being straight means that the muscles have to work hard to hold it straight. And if you do it long enough, the muscles that holds the spine right up to the base becomes stronger. Stronger means more muscle mass. More muscle mass means more nerves. More nerves means you can get that energy feel much more stronger, right? So it also helps that posture, because when you straighten your spine, you see that the flow of energy becomes much more better. But when you rest it, it bends. As a matter of fact, most people have curved spine. And this posture is very important because as we age, our backbone starts declining because the weight of our head puts pressure on the spine, and then you see that parts of the inner part starts disintegrating, and it becomes even worse for women. As they age, osteoporosis comes in, the weight puts pressure on the backbone, and you start seeing disintegration of the bones, and you start seeing the nerves, you get pinching of the nerves. So as we age, our spinal cord health is so important, because that's the highway of flow, right? That flow also, as the energy flows better, it helps us to calm our brain better, because better flow means better movement of blood, oxygen across the whole head and the brain. And you see that the brain is able to calm down, because the biggest user of oxygen in our body is our brain. If there is constriction, you see that your heart has to work harder. And you see that you get all kinds of palpitation and high blood pressure and so on. So the ability to sit in that posture that helps you to open your hip, the flexibility, the straightness of our spine, this posture enables the flow that flushes the mind with so much, that life force or vibration or the electrical pulse, whatever you call it, which also drives, the blood circulation. And you see that your body is flushed with blood and with oxygen, and you see that your heart doesn't have to work really hard. It becomes more calmer and cooler. Your breathing improves. So anybody that sits in this position for meditation, you see that their calmness level, their peacefulness level, the level of pressure is very optimal. Right? With that comes, when we have the calmness, the coolness, our breathing, our heart rates, everything becomes really good. The ability to become aware and focus improves intensively. Right? The ability to not be distracted improves significantly. So this lotus position is a very important position that helps us in many, many ways. This lotus position for women, it also, if you sit down more regularly like this, you see that those who have the menstrual cycle will have less likely have cramps, because as I said, it exercises that muscles, right? And for men, you see that as we age, our prostate are impacted. So if you did this regularly, sitting down and eating on the floor, or sitting down and meditating regularly, that exercise helps with the flow of energy into that base, and it helps men particularly with respect to their prostate. So we see that this meditational practice of simple sitting down in the lotus position has tremendous benefit in terms of the flow of our electrical pulse, the flow of Kundalini energy. It helps us with the flow of blood and oxygen. It stretches our legs and exercises our muscles. That brings in so much benefit for both men and women. And this is very important because as we age, we see that our muscle mass declines. So any exercise that we do to retain that activity that will stimulate the muscle, the buildup of the muscles, is very helpful in slowing down that aging process. And we see that, so one of the benefits of meditation by sitting like this is actually there are so many knock-on effects, right? Our muscles are stimulated, nerves are, much more efficient, the flow is great, and you see that your body health becomes great. You become very, very, alert. You don't get tired very fast, the flow is really good. Our sleep patterns become really great. We can sleep very well because there's flush of oxygen and all the hormones, the happy hormones in our system. So we see that the 12th part of our physiology is so important in helping all the other 11 parts to really function really well, coordinate really well, the information flow become efficient to help the brain health, make the brain healthy, make our organs healthy, make our body healthy. And you see that when you regularly start sitting in this position, you feel more alert, you feel more healthy, you feel greater flow of energy. So this is something that, if you see Mahan and all the great saints and sages, many of them sit in this position. It is like an asana on its own. And that asana has a tremendous benefit. So if you see here, Mahan is sitting in this position, in this meditational position. And if you see in many of these photographs, he sits in this position. It's somewhat like a flame-like position, like a pyramid-like position where the base gives you full support for that sharpness to take place. So this is something that I learned in Mahan's practice, that when I sit on a chair and meditate in the early phase of my, is very different from sitting in this position and meditating. So I always encourage those who are just starting to meditate, you should start sitting in this position to experience that benefit, the full experience of that healthy body, healthy spinal cord, healthy brain, and healthy, meditational sadhana and practice. So this is something that I want to let you know. Later on, when I come to Swamiji's meditational method, I'll show you how the flow from the base that he raises up to the third eye becomes essential, and this sitting position is crucial in enabling that flow much more profoundly and more intensively. And when you practice this, you see that, our spinal cord, our, for men, the prostate, for women, the menstrual cycle, generally our health of the body improves. And if you did it every day, it's like doing every day a yoga asana. And if you did it 2-3 times, you meditate a day, that is actually exercising, all parts of your body. Those days, people used to sit on the floor and eat. If you see many pictures, Swamiji actually sits on the floor and eat. And I didn't realize it until later part when I really sat down and analyzed this. It is actually a yoga asana itself that brings tremendous health to the body, to the brain, and to the spinal cord. So my suggestion to all of y'all that have difficulty, try to stretch slowly, and see if you can at least try for a few minutes. If it doesn't work, then you go back to your sitting in the chair and meditating. But for those who are just starting to meditate, this is the best position to meditate. Sandosham, I'll stop here. And the next class, I will cover what happens if all the 12 areas of our body is charged, from the prefrontal cortex right up to our spinal cord. What would that meditational experience be? So I touched on one by one. When you bring all of it together, you get that experience that sometimes people call the blissful experience. Why do we get that? I will speak about that next week, and then I will go into Mahan's first stage of initiation, the parts of the brains that are fired up, second stage, third stage, and then bringing all three together, you'll see that the fusion. And ultimately, what will happen is that when you do that, it actually stimulates key hormones. And I covered in the last class, last satsang, about the happy hormones. And you see that something beautiful happens at that blissful moment. Your body feels fantastic. Your brain feels fantastic. All the happy hormones are released in the system. You feel very happy, inspired. You feel really, really alert throughout the day. Whole body system is flushed with these hormones. And it is good for the health of the body. It's also good for the brain and the mind to be sharp and on the ball, as we say. And you can actually start feeling your own the life force reverberating very strong. This is what the connected state is. And then later on, I'll explain how that takes us deeper into that more deeper self-realization state of existence. I'll stop here. Sandosham.